Okay, great. So thanks so much. I'm really happy to talk with this group a bit about a project in San Francisco Bay where we're matching removal of derelict creosote pilings and wharf structures with living shorelines as phase 2 after that activity. And it's really an effort to kind of re-envision our very urbanized Bay Edge. We have one of the most urbanized estuaries on the West Coast and an incredible amount of fill and riprap and levees and seawalls, as I know many of you do in your areas. So I'll share a bit about this project where we're embarking on removing pilings and planning for restoration. So I want to start out with just a reference to a regional plan that really helped to set the recommendations in this project and our techniques. This is the San Francisco Bay Subtidal Habitat Goals project, and I know many of you may have heard me talk about this before at the Hartford meeting or others, but we're real proud of this effort. This was completed in 2010. It involved 4 lead state and federal agencies, the State Coastal Conservancy, my agency in California, our regulatory agency, Bay Conservation and Development Commission for San Francisco Bay, NOAA, Fisheries and Restoration Center, and then our NEP program here, the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. And so this was completed in 2010. There was a lot of interest in developing a long-term conservation plan for the submerged areas of the bay, but we have a lot of data gaps. So it took a lot of time to get this to fruition. But I put the website up here, sfbaysubtitle.org, and also a similar document, the Baylands Goals Science Update, which is more for tidal wetlands as well as their associated bay edge and upland ecotone edge. And I hope that these might provide a model for others around the country who are looking at regional conservation planning with a wide variety of state, local, and federal partners. But basically that plan came out with goals for research, protection, restoration, and then specifically creosote piling removal. And there's a great website which shows maps of a lot of these features in the submerged areas, or at least the data we have. So on the right there you can see the eelgrass layer, and that shows the main eelgrass beds in San Francisco Bay. And you can also look at stressors, you can look at native oyster layers, you can look at a lot of the different creosote piling layers, all of the data that was collected during this project. So what we're really, I know I'm really preaching to the choir here, so I want to keep this conversation short and allow time for discussion, but obviously we're real concerned about the impacts from derelict structures and specifically creosote pilings. You know, these areas are, we have about 33,000 pilings that were mapped in San Francisco Bay that could be seen at low tide, and then they estimate that at least that many are on the bottom in terms of bits and stubs. So it's a pretty major impact in our estuary that involves dredging, fill, structures, you know, loss of the habitat values on those shorelines, a lot of impacts, erosion, you know, high cost to either clean them up or maintain them. And I really want to point out that, you know, with resilience for climate and sea level rise, I don't want everyone to kind of gloss over the good old shoreline cleanup, which is often an important first step before we can install living shorelines or other types of more adaptive nature-based features. So we're really hoping to kind of go from this picture on the top right, which you see, which is our Red Rock site I'll talk about, to a living shoreline. And this picture on the bottom left is a project we constructed in San Rafael, right across the bay from this site. But we've taken a lot of the lessons learned and are hoping to, you know, really enhance these biologically dynamic borders and achieve all of the goals of living shorelines that I know you all are very well familiar with. And we're focusing on our native species here. So we have native Olympia oysters and eelgrass are 2 of the main species that we're focusing on in terms of getting out this old fill and helping to allow for passive restoration of these species as well as some active restoration that we have in our plans. We're interested in these species not only for the species themselves, but the 3-dimensional habitat structure that they provide. And especially eelgrass provides a natural spawning substrate for Pacific herring, which is our last native commercial fishery in San Francisco Bay. And there's been a lot of studies, Gary Scher of UC Davis, many others, Susan Williams, have done more than 2 decades of study looking at the contamination effects on Pacific herring. And it is toxic to them. They've shown that there's deformities to herring embryos that attach onto those piling surfaces. And so it's a big problem that we'd like to replace those old creosote pilings with natural eelgrass beds and other natural habitat types in the bay. Creosote's been outlawed since 1991 by our Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife, and so concrete is the preferred infrastructure for pilings. Most of the functioning infrastructure in the bay, you can kind of see in this nice graphic on the bottom, the San Francisco Bay shoreline, Port of San Francisco and others have done a lot of work to replace the functioning infrastructure, but it's the derelict ones that don't really have a hero or, you know, landowners, recognizable landowners, because oftentimes it's many on those submerged parcels who can take responsibility. So the State Coastal Conservancy and other partners are coming in to pilot these approaches and try to encourage others to do more piling removal. So again, here's just some maps of our San Francisco estuary, Pacific Ocean here on the left side. We've got our North Bay, Central Bay by San Francisco going into the South Bay. And with this project, it was substantially supported by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We actually got a $2 million grant from them to support this work. And then AECOM, Ducks Unlimited, Markle and Associates, and others were very involved in both the site selection, which I'll talk a little bit about, and then the demolition and restoration design plans. So basically, I mentioned that these pilings have been mapped. This is some of the piling layer that you can click on the Subtitle Goals website. And there are hot spots that were identified where there's major conglomerations of those 33,000. The Richmond area is one, the Carquinez area going out towards Sacramento, the San Francisco shoreline, and also the mouth of the Napa River up here. And so you can see this map also here, and this section of Richmond, you can see a smaller map showing various stressors and habitat types. We have the largest eelgrass bed in the bay offshore from this site in Richmond, and a lot of rich intertidal and subtidal resources, but then a lot of heavy industry going back to shipbuilding with World War II, and other industry that's occurring in the city of Richmond. So I just want to talk very briefly about our site selection model. We didn't know what was the best site to choose for this project at the beginning, so that was a big component of this project, was really to look at both where are the creosote pilings a big problem and where are the largest conglomerations of pilings, and then match that against where it would be most beneficial for Pacific herring. And so these maps just kind of show the data sets that we looked at with our consultants. Suitability for eelgrass and oysters, Keith Merkel developed a model looking at that. We also looked at the bathymetry, obviously, and the herring spawning density and frequency over the past 40 years with data from our Cal Department of Fish and Wildlife. Kind of looked at that bay-wide distribution of pilings in terms of how large the complexes were, and then in the end matched all of that, assigned scores to all of those, and came up with a site suitability map that kind of showed where all of these factors aligned best. And so then we took those results and put them into step 2 of the model, and really, again, focused on assigning final counts to the piling count score. You can see the largest number of pilings at any one site are listed in these larger circles and bubbles. So again, this Richmond area where we did the project. And then the suitability for restoration objectives. So that can include everything from the correct depths and conditions for oysters and eelgrass, but also the depths and access routes, thinking about where equipment can get into, because obviously that shallow subtidal, deep intertidal is a really hard zone for us to get to in the bay with large equipment. But all of that led us to come out with a final suitability rating. And you can see that this range is the green are the best ratings for these sites in the bay, and then kind of going to the warmer colors. They still were good candidates, but didn't achieve all that criteria as well as the green. And I just wanted to point out, through this assessment, we didn't realize that so many of these pilings are in very small numbers, disparately spread throughout the bay. So this graphic just shows there's only about 6 structures that have more than 150 or so pilings at at one location, you know, where there's an old wharf that's still intact or degrading. The biggest problem of these 33,000 pilings are the individual 1s, 2s, 10s, you know, the dolphin navigators for navigation. Those are spread out bay-wide, and so that's caused us to think a lot more about how to approach that problem, because, you know, planning and design and permitting for 10 pilings at a time just isn't going to work. So we're trying to really get at these larger structures first and then think about how to get to the smaller amounts. And so these are the 6 sites that fell out as the top candidates for the project. This is the Richmond San Rafael Bridge, if anyone's familiar with that feature in San Francisco Bay. Sausalito here, San Francisco sort of down here on the map, if you can see my cursor. Can you guys see my cursor, Suzanne?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm just pointing things out. I'll try not to shake it too much. This is the Red Rock warehouse that we eventually chose for the project. After we did side scan surveys, our consultants, Merkel and others, did side scan surveys of all 6 of these sites, and further looked more specifically at the access, the land ownership, you know, who would be willing landowners, etc. And so we did choose the Red Rock warehouse in Richmond. These are the pictures of it on the left-hand side. It had a really high score for both the amount of pilings that we could move to create a positive impact, and then also the, you know, it's offshore, just inshore from that large eelgrass bed in the bay, and a lot of oyster and intertidal resources that we wanted to enhance. And here's a picture of the site. I just kind of wanted to show this because the site has just such a mix of urbanization and, you know, old infrastructure that's degrading and causing a problem, but then you can still see there's quite a, you know, good base of intertidal habitat that's still existing there. I mean, you can see a lot of ulva, the sea lettuce, which is a species that, you know, deals well with contamination or poor conditions, so obviously it's a dominant here. But you can also see things like our Pacific rockweed, Fucus gardneri, which is an important intertidal seaweed that we were hoping to also benefit, as well as the oyster and eelgrass populations offshore. And these are just a couple other maps of the site. This is at Point San Pablo, so again, this is just north of the Richmond Bridge. Here's where the Red Rock warehouse was, and the actual warehouse is here on the shoreline. So we actually had an old warehouse. The whole site had gone through a fire several decades ago, so again, even more degraded because of that. And so bits of pilings, you know, the pilings were in poor condition, the warehouse was in very poor condition, and this all led us to choose this site for the removal. You can see all the individual mapped pilings here on the top right. Although I will point out, as anyone who's done these projects knows, it's very difficult to accurately estimate exactly what's down there. We estimated between 300 and 350 pilings, and the contractor ended up pulling out more than 450. So it is tricky being able to accurately assess everything, and that's an important factor for the contractors. It's a difficult and challenging environment to work in with barges and equipment, and I'll talk just very briefly about that in the next slide. And then I also just want to point out the largest derelict structure in the bay is directly south of this area. It's the Terminal 4 warehouse. This is 2,500 pilings, and then a former wharf and warehouse that was a site of major shipping with agricultural materials and others historically in the bay. And so we are actively planning and fundraising for the removal of this structure with the City of Richmond and NOAA and others, and we're using this site as a model to try and help build some lessons learned as much as they can apply to this other site. Even being so close, the Red Rock site is much shallower. It's got a different wave orientation than the deeper Terminal 4 site, so there are some different considerations. And then also Terminal 4 has about 2,000 of those are estimated to be concrete or concrete wrapped pilings, and then about 500 creosote. So it will be a more expensive project, Terminal 4, because it's deeper and it's concrete, so it's going to be harder to get out. But again, you can see the types of materials that we were pulling out at the Red Rock site. You can also see the amount of concrete that was just, you know, on the shoreline, either falling down from the warehouse structure or concrete on the shoreline that was there. And so this was a huge part of our design factoring. We tried to remove as much as possible of that concrete, but since so much of it was covered in resources, we decided to break that up into smaller 1 to 3 foot bits that could provide some more complex structure for for fucus, the rockweed, and other species. So the removal approach, we actually had a floating barge with excavator and crane at the site, and then a tracked excavator on land. So we were able to do both land-based and water-based equipment. There was stockpiling of the material on the City of Richmond land, and this site actually lent itself very well to that. The site's normally off limits to the public right now. It's in the process of a general plan process and remediation, but it is a good site to kind of conduct this work out of the public eye and not have to deal with things like, you know, odor considerations with housing too close by or things like that. So it was very good in terms of a more industrialized area that could provide areas for stockpiling and storage of the material as it was getting removed. And then I just wanted to briefly talk about, and I really welcome discussion on this with others who have experience with these types of projects. We got conflicting regulatory agency direction during our permitting process and eventually did find some consistent direction from them, but it really took several discussions. With known contaminated sediments here, the preferred method is to cut piles at the mudline so that you are limiting disturbance of that contaminated sediment, hopefully limiting any release. And for uncontaminated sediments, the preferred BMP is to do complete removal if the piles have good enough integrity, so a full extraction of that pile. But if they're in poor integrity and you can't achieve that, then the BMP is to do a cut 2 to 3 feet below the mud line. And this is a difficult topic here. You know, we know there's contamination, PAH-related contamination with the creosote pilings. And so that's assumed, but this is also referring to other types of contamination you might find at these sites or in the sediments. And so we did a lot of work with record searches and talking with the landowners, you know, assessing past records for the site to identify whether there was any contamination. We couldn't identify any particular exact source on the site footprint, but we were aware of many, many sites, you know, within the general area that are cleanup sites. So it took a lot of conversations with the regulatory agencies. They didn't require us to do full sediment testing of 100% of this 4-acre footprint. You know, that would have been too onerous. So we followed this BMP process and to good success with the site. And then just a couple more slides here. Just want to point out some of the environmental protection during the removal. We have really strict work windows here in San Francisco Bay, as I'm sure many of you do around the country, to avoid, you know, for us, steelhead and salmon migration periods, nesting bird migration periods, you know, impacts to eelgrass, essential fish habitat. So there was a lot of pre-construction surveying, very tight construction monitoring, biomonitoring during the removal. Seasonal avoidance, you know, worker training, and we took this very seriously with this project because of the PAH and contamination that we didn't want to disperse. We had plans for relocating things like osprey nests if needed. There are some osprey nests that are close by to the site, but we didn't encounter any nesting within the site footprint, so we didn't have to do that during the work. But the eelgrass beds were marked and avoided. There was turbidity monitoring and water quality monitoring. And in the bottom below, sorry for so many words on the slide, but just a lot of additional plans because of that contamination. So clearing and grubbing plans, marine safety plans, including oil spill response, hazmat management, stormwater pollution prevention plan. So, you know, a lot of additional work on the permitting and design side for a project like this. And then these are just some of the highlights of demolition. It occurred last November, December of 16. There were over 450 pilings removed. Most were in very poor condition, so we cut below the mud lines. Some we did test, and the contractor, Vortex Marine and Ducks Unlimited, they could achieve full extraction with a few as a test, but it was very rare that they could get that. Over 445 tons of debris was removed from the site. Again, it was an extremely challenging work area for the contractor, and I really want to thank Vortex Marine for their great work on this. One story I just want to briefly mention is, you know, it is a challenging work area. They want, you know, in order to time the tides right to get this equipment in there and conduct the work and get out before low tide, you know, all of those considerations had to be pretty carefully planned out. They did have one instance where their barge actually, bumped up against some debris on the bottom and punched a hole in the barge. And so they had to back off work that day. We had to let the State Water Resources Control Board know about that. They were able to patch the barge and continue work. It wasn't a major event, but it did, these are considerations that you have to think of as you're working through these projects and how to deal with these types of instances if they come up. So our total demolition cost was a little over $700,000, and the total project cost, again, is $2 million, which seems so high, but it really helped to provide a lot of that assessment that could be used for other sites in the bay, and then included all the activities you see here, including the restoration. And these are just some before-after pictures that I'd love to show. Even before the restoration phase, there's obviously just a major improvement to this site, although you can see the concrete chunks that we left in the bottom left and in the top. So, it's certainly not a perfectly natural shoreline edge after the removal, but much improved. And then just briefly with the restoration plans, we're planning to put in 3 species, eelgrass, rockweed, and oyster reefs. And I'm realizing time is tight and I don't want to not allow for discussion, so I'm going to keep going and we can talk about these during discussion. But this is a design of our restoration plan. So we're still in the testing phase. We're testing these, 3 types of oyster elements: oyster blocks, reef balls, and shellbag mounds, bare root plantings of eelgrass, and then testing different tidal heights. So you can kind of see those larger plots that are a bit deeper and then the smaller plots that are closer inshore, so we can look at tidal height configurations. And these are our lessons learned, and I'm sorry for all the words, but again, I think the main thing for us is to allow more time for design and permitting with this type of project. We had some issues with consistency, both with just the staff turnover at regulatory agencies during the process and also with different conflicting input from different staff. So I would, really encourage folks to check in regularly, go to any interagency meetings and talk with them as a group. We did have a private site that we did a lot of planning for and we're planning to include as well, and that private landowner backed out at the last minute. The husband and wife, the husband really wanted to see it happen and the wife really liked looking at the pilings and looking at birds sitting on the pilings. And that became a big issue in the end. So just really encourage, landowner approvals and documentation early, really allowing enough time between the stages of work. We had a pretty fast pace between, securing permits and then going to bidding. And so if you slow down, that allows more time to really thoughtfully plan. And then we did not have shoreline, deterioration after, but I would really, encourage people to really look at the physical analysis of shoreline effects after removal of these structures. And that's increasingly important with that larger site I mentioned to the south. I think I'm going to stop talking here because we're getting so close to the end, and I'd love to welcome any questions and hear more from anyone who's conducted these types of projects. Thanks so much.
Oh, Marilyn, that was fantastic. Love it, love it. So if you have a question or a comment, if you could please virtually raise your hand, and we'll go through the same thing as the update. Or you can send the question directly to me and I'll be happy to report it out. The other thing is we can continue past the 2 o'clock hour. As I mentioned, we are recording this. So if folks want to stay on the line and, we can continue talking. Actually, Meryl, my recommendation right now, I think people are still taking it all in. Could you go back to the lessons learned and continue to perhaps work through that? I have to say, I do love the conflicting husband and wife, that seems to be almost comically and unfortunately stereotypical, that people can't agree on what they want to do with their land and the view shed and all of that. So yeah, if you could keep going on with that, and if we get any questions, I will let you know.
Sure. Yeah, I think that was a really interesting case with the private landowners. And again, it was hard that in the end they decided not to do it because there was such interest. I heard that the woman's grandchildren were even shaming her into doing it, and she was feeling a lot of pressure from everyone about her decision to not participate in the project. But now, actually, on that note, the USGS is looking at a project to test wrapping or modifying pilings with, to limit that creosote impact and provide a better substrate even on an old creosote piling. And so they're now talking with the landowners, and hopefully they're going to participate in that project. So even if they can't do the full, gold-plated restoration, maybe there's ways to get homeowners engaged in a lesser level of effort. Yeah, I think just to continue briefly with these last bullets, direct lines of communication between the lead agency, the contractor, and the subcontractors we found is really important. It didn't go poorly, but we saw specific areas, especially during that barge incident I mentioned, where I think it's more important to define a chain of command, make sure that certain communication occurs quickly between the subcontractors, the contractor, and the lead, so that the correct agencies can be notified if anything is, any issues come up. We're very much planning on trying to develop a programmatic permit approach for all these disparate pilings that are spread throughout the bay, and I'm hopeful that that can happen. Might be able to develop a regional general permit through the Corps or our BCDC. And from our San Rafael project, the lessons learned we folded into this restoration design, we haven't found that co-locating eelgrass plantings and oyster reefs actually provides benefit to the other. We were hoping we would see that, i.e. oyster reefs slowing down wave energy, potentially improving turbidity for eelgrass that needs light availability, things like that. But we haven't been able to see that. In fact, we've seen if you place them too close together, there can be impacts, abrasion of the eelgrass on the oyster reef structures, or just limiting the footprint where eelgrass can expand. So with this project, we separated them a bit more, but we still want to include both habitat types because we found that invertebrate and fish species, there's specific guilds associated with each one. So you increase biodiversity if you include both habitat types in the project. But of course, we've only done a few of these projects, so we are very cognizant that we need to test this at more locations, new designs, further evaluate what techniques are going to work best at what sites and what shoreline typologies. And we're really interested to add in additional habitat types, and we are to our Living Shorelines designs. Rockweed was the species that we added in at Red Rocks that I was talking about today. And we also have a project just up the shore in Richmond, our Giant Marsh Living Shorelines project, where it's actually subtitled a supratitle. We've got tidal marsh treatments in terms of vegetative plantings, as well as upland ecotone treatments. So we're really interested in that whole habitat connectivity, as well as sort of the physical benefit that that full equation could add up to in terms of wave attenuation. So that's sort of finishing that. If we don't have questions, I'd be happy if folks want to email, or I just really love to throw out there if people are aware of model, wharf removal, creosote piling removal projects matched with restoration in other areas of the country. I'd love to welcome discussion or info on that, offline. So if anyone wants to share that, I'd really welcome that. And my phone and email is here on the screen.
All right, that was fantastic. Thank you very much, Marilyn. And right now we don't have any hands up or questions coming in, but I would definitely encourage folks to contact Marilyn, or if you need to reach her, go ahead and email me. And so Marilyn, can you give me the screen back, please?
Yes, I think I can do that. Actually,
I might be able to do it. Let me see. Oh, there we go.
Did you get it back? Great.
All right. Okie dokie. All right. So I'll just go ahead and leave that at PowerPoint. So maybe I won't. There we go. So if you have any questions, there's my information and Marilyn's information. If you want more information on Ray's Living Shorelines program, it's there, and also the Living Shorelines Academy. So Marilyn, thank you again. That was wonderful. And thank you to everybody else who joined us. With that, I will go ahead and wrap it up, and again, encourage you to reach out to either myself or Marilyn if you have questions. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for an announcement of this webinar being available online. Have a great day, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks.